Governments want to change our behaviour. That's what they do. They want us to get thinner. They're worried about obesity. They want us to use our cars less because they're worried about climate change and a whole variety of other things. They want us to drink less, all sorts of things. And that's really one of the key things that governments do. So, how do they change our behaviour? Well, this present government is particularly interested in what they call behavioural change interventions that are relatively soft. They call them nudges. And that comes from two American behavioural scientists, Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein. And what they say is you just change the default. So, for instance, we have rumble strips on the road and they make you slow down. Or you change the design of a form and that makes you more likely or less likely to do something. Or where, for instance, in supermarkets products are placed, nudges you to be more likely or slightly less likely to buy them. Those are nudges. And it was the present government's emphasis on using that kind of intervention rather than regulation or fiscal interventions that made us particularly keen to look at what's the science behind this, the behavioural psychology science, the behavioural economic science behind this. What do we really know about the science of changing people's behaviour? The committee took evidence from about 70 people in person and then from about 150 people in writing, or organisations in writing. And we heard from a lot of experts, from psychologists, from economists, from advertising people, from supermarkets, from the alcohol industry and a variety of other people who have expertise. And we heard from people with very different views and we drew our conclusions from that. We also heard, if you like, a fair amount of theory, and we had a specialist advisor who's a specialist in this kind of area. The key finding of our inquiry is that nudges, these small behavioural interventions on their own, are very unlikely to give us a serious behaviour change in the population as a whole. And we came to the conclusion that actually government should look at using a whole array of interventions, from these behavioural interventions to taxation, to regulation, to legislation. And it's a package of measures that tend to help change people's behaviour. And we know that to some extent from previous experience. Like, for instance, people will remember with seatbelts, clunk, click every trip, people remember as the slogan, but there was legislation there as well. There was a campaign to persuade you. There were a whole variety of things all happening at the same time, which made it more likely that the population would change their behaviour, and indeed they did. The committee hopes that the government will listen to its report, will read it with real interest, and will take up some of our recommendations. Amongst the ones we hope that they will take up quickly are the appointment of an independent chief social scientist. We were very surprised, given the present government's emphasis on using these kinds of behavioural interventions, that there isn't an independent chief social scientist in government. There are civil servants who are social scientists, but we think if government is relying heavily on this kind of intervention, then independent advice into government is absolutely critical. And we also think that an independent chief social scientist can, with the government's chief scientist, work with departments so that anything they do along these lines is properly evaluated so that government knows for the future. We hope that they will look at their behavioural interventions, and there's a behavioural insights team in the Cabinet Office, and we hope that they will look at putting those interventions together with other interventions to get behaviour change, if you like, properly fixed in departments. We also hope that they will look again at the question of food labelling, which was an area where we had some very strong evidence from, amongst others, Justin King at Sainsbury's, to suggest that food labelling with a traffic light system, red, amber, green, is more effective in changing the public's behaviour in its shopping patterns than the present government system, where you have percentages of recommended daily amounts. And we were very struck by that, because it was pretty clear that in Sainsbury's anyway, shoppers were doing things in a different way as a result. And therefore we hope that the government will look at that one closely, as it also looks at the voluntary agreements it's had with the food industry and the drinks industry, and puts a time frame on them to see whether they've been effective, and decides that if they've not been effective, to do other things as well.